Hello, I'm Matt Reardon, and thanks for watching this October 18th, Wednesday evening West Weather Update brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. Thought I'd start here. This is, I think, starting about as big picture as we can. I'll zoom this in a little bit to make it more clear. We're really looking at the last 45 days of precipitation anomalies across the globe. So not only looking at the western U.S., Australia, Antarctica, you name it, it's on here from the Climate Prediction Center. It's not the most refined measurement, but I think kind of the broad strokes here are enough to tell the story. And the story has been El Nino. It's been developing since summer. And it's, the focus that we talk about here in the western U.S. is largely, right, on whether it's going to impact California with a bountiful water year, the Northwest, etc. But it's really this global circulation centered around the Pacific Ocean. We've talked about this many times this year. And it has global effects as a global circulation. Now, most of those effects are centered kind of around the ring of the Pacific. So areas like the western U.S., South America, and then going over to Asia and Australia as well. And, we often say every El Nino is unique. It's different. None of them kind of follow, at least most of them don't follow kind of a textbook example of what you'd expect for every, El Nino when averaged out. And I think at least, starting this autumn here and looking at the last 45 days of precipitation anomalies, we're seeing that. And what I mean by that is you get this kind of predictable global effect of El Nino, and kind of one of the things we typically expect is a drier start to spring. In Australia, being in the southern hemisphere, it's their spring season, and we see that if we look at precipitation anomalies in Australia, it's certainly been drier than average there over the last 45 days. We jump over to South America. Typically, kind of the northern half of South America sees drier conditions into their spring and summer. And we're seeing that there as well. And as you go south in South America, you tend to get wetter during some of these El Nino years. And we've seen that in parts of southern Brazil and even in parts of Argentina at times. Now, when you jump up to the northwestern U.S., the kind of typical flipping back to the textbook example for El Nino, would typically call an autumn for these warmer, drier conditions. You've heard me mention that a few times this year. But if you zoom in closely here and look at parts of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, even parts of Montana, that hasn't been the case. So I think, unfortunately, another good example of how every El Nino is different. This one, when you kind of average everything out globally, might be playing along with the textbook. But of course, when you get closer and get fine-grained with it, some of those correlations, aren't as kind of home run or predictable. And that's just the way these things work kind of on a seasonal time scale. It's why we can never be too confident whenever we're talking about kind of a winter forecast, at least at this point, or even getting into spring of 24. Now, I will say Australia, those predictions have been rather predictable at this point in terms of the effects of El Nino, parts of Indonesia too. It's also, I think, related to the Indian Ocean Dipole, which is kind of its own teleconnection we watch all the way over in the Indian Ocean, very much linked and similar to El Nino. And one of the effects of those two kind of working in concert is we've started very dry in El Nino, or very dry this spring in Australia, looking at kind of the northern third of the continent here. And you can see, unfortunately, one of the effects of the drought there in Australia, just a tremendous amount of bushfires going up in October here. Another thing is I'm kind of replaying the loop here that I'll point you out besides the number of fires burning here in northern Australia is if you look up closely, kind of the top right portion of this graph, if you look closely at this kind of linear cloud coming off the Gulf of Carpentaria, that is what you call a morning glory cloud. And it's really kind of a roll cloud is what we typically call this in the U.S., or an undulate bore is maybe a more technical term. But these really only happen kind of regularly, at least predictably, in the spring season in Australia and just here on this recent loop, kind of a great example of one of these roll clouds. You might have seen a picture of one of these. They're pretty cool. I believe paragliders kind of go up and over these if they're rather brave when they're more predictable like this. But just kind of a cool thing I noticed there when looking at some of the bushfires. Wanted to share that with all of you. One of the other kind of predictable effects of an El Nino global circulation, those sea surface temperature anomalies, is a more active eastern Pacific hurricane season. And certainly this year, again, while every El Nino may not follow that textbook example, this year it's followed that as well. We're kind of running above average in terms of that eastern Pacific hurricane season. And maybe a given year, when you total the full season for the eastern Pacific, we typically wind up with 14 or 15 named storms when all is said and done. And we're definitely getting into the latter half, getting toward the end of the season in the Eastern Pacific, and we've already had 14 named storms. Looking at the Colorado State University track record for this year in 2023, you can see Adrian all the way through Norma, recently forming the Eastern Pacific. Another way we measure some of these tropical storm strength over time is this term ACE, just kind of a measure of the integrated amount of energy they have released over the season, and that is the blue line here for this year. in 2023. And that climatological average for a normal year is just below that on this curve here. And you can see we're certainly above average and have really been above average in the Eastern Pacific for the last few forecasts, certainly. And you look here Really from about August 1st, at the beginning of the month there, we've been above average, and we've stayed above average in the Eastern Pacific for hurricanes. Not all of them have had an effect on land, fortunately. That's typically the case in the Eastern Pacific, but unfortunately we have had some unfortunate impacts from some of the hurricanes this year there. We are following here this afternoon. This is Tropical Storm Norma, like I said, formed recently here in the Eastern Pacific. Kind of the quick glance at Tropical Storm Norma here doesn't look like your typical tropical storm. I feel like I've said that a few times this year with all that warm water in the Eastern Pacific. Tropical Storm Norma definitely looks like it wants to be a hurricane. In fact, by the time I get this video published here this afternoon or evening, I would expect there's probably a decent chance that it has been upgraded to a Category 1 hurricane. And you can just see very nice outflow in the upper level, kind of infrared satellite imagery here surrounding the storm, deep tropical thunderstorms quickly rotating around the middle of that, trying to form an eye that's going to stand out there on satellite imagery. Clear that this is a pretty strong storm. The expectation just from looking at this picture is that it's likely going to be a hurricane soon, potentially strengthening after that, and that is the forecast from the National Hurricane Center, that through the end of this week, expecting a strengthening of the storm pretty quickly into a potential major hurricane as we get toward the weekend. Now, where it goes after that, as we get into next week, there's a lot of uncertainty here. The model's kind of going back and forth. We're pretty sure that it's going to continue to advance to the north-northwest, potentially stalling out somewhere here south of that Baja California peninsula, where, it's almost anyone's guess where it's going to go after that. Now, the expectation is not it's going to be a threat to the U.S., anything like that, but we're thinking right now it might get kind of absorbed up into the continent, across Mexico, into the southern U.S. There is a chance, and I'll play this forecast forward here from the ECMWF, kind of looking at the bottom of the screen at Tropical Storm Norma here. There is a chance as it pushes north that some of this moisture plume at some point next week, perhaps by Wednesday, tries to get up into the southwestern U.S. You can see the ECMWF pushing kind of some rain shield here into far southeastern Arizona, parts of New Mexico. But I think the chance of it pushing further west, let's say up into the lower Colorado River Valley, or bringing rainfall or extra moisture to this, let's say, Southern California coastline is a little bit lower. Right now, I'd consider that unlikely. But given some of the uncertainty now of this forecast all the way out here Wednesday of next week, October 25th, I can't rule it out entirely. Likely to be a rainmaker for some folks here across the southern U.S. as the remnants, not kind of a bona fide tropical storm at this point, but the remnants and that extra moisture, as we've seen this year, can cause rainfall to push into parts of the United States. Now, if I take this forecast, I'll just leave it here. It's parked here right at the kind of the 7-day point. You can kind of imagine there's something else we have to talk about here. We're seeing a big low pressure system come into the northwest U.S. I'll leave it here. I won't get too much into the details here because I'll talk about that in just a few slides here. But we are seeing a potential return to a more colder, wetter pattern coming through the northwest. And it kind of feels like this broken record at this point of storm system after storm system. I think last week we saw maybe, I posed what could be a light at the end of the tunnel if you're trying to get out of some of this rainier pattern where we're shifting into the warmer weather that we're seeing here today, might see a shift into warmer, drier conditions. But as the models came in at the end of the week and then through the weekend, we've just seen them shift kind of back to this pattern that we've been stuck in. It kind of feels like at least at some point in September we shifted into it, and then now through October certainly. And so I went ahead just to kind of see where this sat. And I said, what has the jet stream looked like on average, the mean of that jet stream over the last 30 days? So from September 15th to October 15th. And if you look here at that jet stream, you can see very strong Pacific jet stream coming onshore here in parts of Oregon, leaving us in something of a weak trough here. We do see some what we'll call split flow. And what I mean by that is this Pacific jet stream splits toward the south into parts of Oregon and Washington, and has tried to split at times up into northern Canada. We often see that split, sometimes in these El Nino years or near the Pacific, but it's happening almost so close to the continent here. We're not getting the kind of typical El Nino effects from that. And I guess what I mean by that, in a typical kind of water year, we get the split somewhere further out here in the Pacific, and that splits into the subtropical branch, which can bring rainfall into California, parts of Arizona, the lower Colorado River Valley, things we've talked about as a potential forecast this winter. And then that split, if it's further out in the Pacific, leaves Washington, Oregon, Montana more so under an upper level ridge. And that's what typically brings in that more maybe textbook, drier, warmer weather. But the split's happening a little bit more toward the eastern part of the Pacific, toward the continent. It's been a little bit amplified at times, and we're just not seeing that predictable effect of El Nino. It might be because El Nino's still strengthening. It's largely what we call east-based, and those warmer Pacific Ocean waters are more toward the eastern Pacific off the coast of Peru rather than out in the central Pacific where we typically see a more measured typical El Nino. And you might be seeing that here in this kind of very shunted to the south subtropical jet stream. We're starting near Hawaii, which is pretty typical, but staying more onshore in parts of Mexico, coming across the southeastern U.S. where they've seen rainfall this year. So if we want to change this around, get maybe a more predictable or textbook El Nino, we talked about this in the last video, we're going to need to see the split further out into the Pacific. And that's really what I'll be watching for going into this year. I don't want to jump too far on the forecast now, but it might be that even through December, we're still waiting on this split. And we get a less textbook El Nino winter until we get into spring. Like I said at the beginning of this video, those seasonal forecasts are tricky. They can kind of moving target at times, but at least right now, not seeing that kind of predictable El Nino pattern yet, even though, again, globally, we are seeing some of the more predictable effects, go over to Australia or the Eastern Pacific hurricane season. If we get the last 30 days of precipitation as of October 18th here, that's kind of what I've been talking about with that active jet stream coming onshore in Oregon, parts of Washington, seeing a lot of rainfall into the northwest, parts of Washington, the Willamette Valley, the Snake River Valley, at least the upper Snake River, and the Golden Triangle here in Montana, seeing quite a bit of rainfall in area. At one time we were concerned about drought going into this fall, so I think that's good news in terms of staving off long-term drought in this area. And then further toward the south, not seeing a lot of that precipitation here at the end of September, getting into parts of October as well. Temperature-wise, we've been pretty cool. We've avoided any kind of extreme damaging freezes or frosts yet, anything too early. So I think that's good news, despite the fact that over the last 30 days we've been a little bit cooler than average. That's certainly not the case today, though. If I jump over and look at the National Weather Service high temperature forecast here for Wednesday, October 18th, looking at those departures from normal on that color bar here, we can see that we're very much above normal anywhere in the western U.S. I think I can safely say, looking at above normal temperatures today, that's going to continue through the next few days. We talked last week about the upper level ridge that's moved into the area. In fact, I'll jump over and show you that on the ECMWF forecast. This is the jet stream from the European model. I'll make this valid as of Wednesday evening here. You can see this strong upper level ridge, very much the dominant kind of feature in that jet stream right now, different from kind of that more onshore flow we averaged over the last 30 days, and that's provided a break in the precipitation and those cold fronts that have come through. Now, last video I said there was some possibility looking onto that extended forecast that perhaps this upper level ridge was going to stick around, potentially for a week, maybe even more, and we're just not seeing that. The models flip back toward this pattern that we've been in, as I mentioned a few slides ago. And we kind of saw some hints of that when I was showing you the hurricane forecast earlier, of those upper level troughs trying to push back in the northwest, and even some snow being modeled there. And so we'll just take a look at the jet stream going forward here. This is looking into Friday, getting into Saturday. We still see something of an upper level ridge here, a little bit weaker going into the day Saturday, but really by Sunday, we've lost that upper level ridge, perhaps moving out into the east of the Continental Divide, and now we have more of an upper level trough pushing into parts of California, Oregon, Washington under the influence of that. So I'd expect the weather to start to turn Sunday, seeing the influence of an upper level trough, which tends to bring in colder weather, tends to bring in inclement weather, rainfall, potentially even snow this time of year for the upper elevations. So seeing that move in on Monday, and then another colder upper level trough coming out of the northwest, parts of Alaska and British Columbia, becoming more dominant on Tuesday and Wednesday. So kind of a two-parter, ending with this big upper level trough now Wednesday, October 25th, now a 7-day forecast at this point. But when we see these big upper level troughs like this, not one of these kind of little ones kind of sneaking through the pattern like we've seen recently, but these very large upper level troughs where you can essentially draw the axis of the trough surrounding from Alaska all the way through the western U.S., all the way out toward Wisconsin or Minnesota. That's indicative of some pretty cold air in the system, and that starts to set off some alarm bells for frost and freezes. So we've had an active 30 days looking historically. This big trough here, if this were to come true, 7-day forecast at this point, definitely more of a cold air event here versus some of the rainfall events we saw earlier this year. I will take you through that rainfall here quickly just to get some timing on this. I mentioned that trough coming through. I quickly took the forecast through the end of the week here as we're expected to be warm going into the weekend, not much precipitation, but really starting Sunday very early, expecting rainfall to start to push into the area here, parts of western Oregon, central and eastern Washington, potentially even parts of the Sacramento Valley here in California. Coastal California could be seeing some showers from this as well as we go through the day on Sunday. Can't rule out, perhaps a shower trying to sneak into the northern reaches of the San Joaquin Valley as well. We've seen that modeled with some of the forecasts here. A bit stronger here as we get through Sunday night, I should say, and then by Monday pushing off into some of these eastern regions, parts of northwest Montana, overnight perhaps into the upper Snake River Valley as well, even parts of Nevada, getting some rainfall here. As I take this through Tuesday, I mentioned that's when that more cold or even more potent upper level trough trying to push down from British Columbia, and being a colder system coming from the northwest rather than maybe due west, expecting some cooler temperatures and more snowfall from that. So I take this forecast now into Tuesday night. Willamette Valley getting an additional shot of rainfall, so more rainfall expected there. Cascades getting heavy snowfall. Eastern Washington now in on the action in terms of precipitation. Snake River potentially seeing some light shower activity. And for parts of northwest Montana, again, 7-day forecast. Specifics are hard to come by at that point, but likely seeing some sort of snow event midweek next week in parts of northern, central, and northwest Montana, Golden Triangle, potentially even talking about measurable snow falling in the upper Snake River Valley, parts of Nevada as well, and eastern Oregon. Finally clearing out at some point at the end of the week, but I mentioned that big upper level trough pushing in, definitely looking at the risk of frost and freezes across parts of the interior west. I'll talk about that in just a moment here as we look at some of these minimum overnight temperatures. No frost and freeze concerns really here with all the warm temperature that we saw just a bit ago. This valid as of Thursday morning. Friday morning, not really seeing the influence of that trough yet. By Monday, temperatures start to come down a bit under the influence of that first, it's a cooler system bringing a cold front in, but I won't call it the cold trough yet because of the one coming through on Tuesday. You notice temperatures coming down Tuesday. Now we're talking about potentially a freeze event here in northwest Montana. If we get some snowfall out of that first system that comes through, that definitely increases the chances that we're looking at a freeze here on the morning of Tuesday, the 24th. But certainly after Wednesday, when we get that bigger shot of rainfall and then snowfall in northwest Montana, freezing temperatures become very likely there. But then that next big shot of cold air coming down through Thursday, and then ultimately on Friday, where we're talking definite freezing temperatures here in northwest Montana, potentially looking at a freeze event here across much, if not the entire Snake River Valley. Right now, the Willamette Valley kind of escaping this right now in terms of freeze events, but this is just one model, the national blend of models that we're looking at. I can't rule out a frost event here in the Willamette Valley, especially if temperatures drop more into the 35, 34 degree range. Definitely frost territory there. Probably can't rule out a freeze, 32 degrees Fahrenheit and below. I wouldn't say that's likely at this time, but can't rule it out in some of these locations. And then eastern Washington potentially looking at a freeze event here. Central Valley potentially looking at temperatures in the 40s. No freeze or frost there likely, but definitely some colder nights at the end of next week expected. Really across the western U.S., whether it's frozen or otherwise, in the lower Colorado River Valley, looking at highs, or I should say lows overnight in the 50s, potentially low 50s. As well. So definitely more inclement weather coming up. Another one of these big systems. This one a little bit more potent. Definitely talking about frost and freeze more of some of these systems as we go through the end of October here, and then certainly into November. If we get totals from the NBM for precipitation over these two events here, this is valid all the way out as Friday of next week. We can see heavier precipitation again included here in the Willamette Valley. Again, talking 2 inches potentially when all is said and done. Some higher amounts up over half an inch here in far eastern and southern Washington. The Snake River Valley not seeing as much precipitation here, but we're still seeing measurable, maybe a quarter to a third inch, and those values increase as you go up the valley there. And then the Golden Triangle, this is precipitation, but it's really likely some of it in the form of snowfall, especially as you get into later into Monday, later into Tuesday, and then Wednesday. And certainly if some of the snow falls a bit heavier, could be looking at a more significant overnight low temperature event with temperatures in the teens possible. And then just for fun, let's look at those snowfall forecasts over that kind of 8-day to 9-day window. Seeing the Cascades get some snow, seeing parts of the Sierra Nevadas get a few inches of snow here, even parts of Nevada. But again, looking at potentially significant snowfall here in northwest Montana, 5 inches plus. This value here, 10 inches in Great Falls. These modeled snow maps, as we call them, are never very reliable, and they're certainly not reliable in that kind of 7 to 10 day window. So I wouldn't take anything here as verbatim. Really what I see here is there's a chance for significant snowfall in parts of northwest or northern Montana here as we go through the end of the week next week, and likely seeing some mountain snowfall event here when all is said and done from both these systems. But I suppose the silver lining there, the good news is we're getting a fast start to the snowfall season in the Snake River Basin and the watershed, Columbia River as well, and even parts of the upper reaches of the Colorado River Valley and parts of Utah and Colorado seeing some snow here. So that's not necessarily a bad thing when we try to pile up those totals here. And then won't even leave the Sierra Nevadas out with potentially a few inches there, not very significant. If we want to look beyond that, right now I'm in kind of a wait and see mode for any kind of long-term forecast, given what we've seen with this pattern being what I'll call so sticky. So this is looking at those 500 millibar height anomalies. This is valid as of tomorrow. And not a surprise to see that upper level ridge still dominating the pattern across the western U.S. Those warm temperatures likely as we get through the weekend here before the next system comes in. Really on Sunday, You can see that start to push into the area, bringing a cold front and those temperatures down a little bit as that rainfall increases across parts of Northern California, Oregon, and then ultimately east into parts of Idaho and Montana late into Monday. But it's really this next system here that brings the temperatures even colder into that deep freeze territory for parts of Montana, with freeze implications potentially for the Snake River Valley and eastern Washington as well. You can see how this one much more potent than that first one that came through on Sunday. We're now talking about Wednesday and Thursday in terms of these upper level height map forecasts here. If I let the forecast go beyond that, you'll see the ECMWF specifically here kind of revert back to our long-range forecast that we've seen a little bit this year, which is the potential for an upper-level ridge to move back into the area, high temperatures, drier weather persisting for parts of the Northwest. But I mentioned kind of right at the beginning of this, I'm in a wait-and-see mode with El Nino still a little bit east-based, still slowly strengthening. We just haven't seen this pattern here. Forecast for kind of the beginning of November, the very end of next week through the weekend. I'm in a wait-and-see mode as to whether this develops or not, because we haven't seen it come to fruition as we get closer to that valid forecast date. The models have been switching around quite a bit. You can even see what I was talking about, that potential split in the jet stream here if you look closely. So models are kind of reverting back to this kind of in the long range here. We're talking way out the 13 to 15 day range. And I'm just I'll see it when I see it. I'm not going to make this forecast right now, given what we've seen and how sticky and persistent the pattern has been so far this fall. If we look at the 6 to 10 day temperature outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, definitely looking at colder temperatures through parts of the Northwest U.S., really all throughout the western region, save for parts of coastal California. As far as precipitation, expecting more above average precipitation in those interior west regions. We talked about Idaho, Montana. Because the Willamette Valley is seeing a lot of that rainfall really kind of early next week, not technically quite in that 6 to 10 day window here, but they're definitely seeing that rainfall here next week despite being left out of the 6 to 10 day above average window here. If we take it out to the 8 to 14 day forecast here from the Climate Prediction Center, still seeing those cooler temperatures last through the end of next week. We talked about those deep overnight lows possible in parts of Montana with the snowpack there. But you can see even here the Climate Prediction Center looking at a potential warm up after that and potentially a drier shift as we go through the end of October, maybe even getting out into early November. I'm not saying, they're wrong. I'm not saying that's a bad forecast right now. Just kind of based on what we've seen, based on how sticky this pattern is, it's going to be a wait and see if we can get a more kind of typical El Nino fall-like pattern. It's possible if you've looked kind of recently at some of the El Nino indices where we measure it proper in the Central Pacific. We've been slowly strengthening right throughout the end of summer. You can see July 26th here out through October 18th, slowly strengthening, even a little bit of a bump here in that El Nino index over the last few days here, over the last week or so. So we might be El Nino trying to strengthen a bit and get a more predictable pattern across the western U.S., but haven't quite seen it yet in that jet stream flow pattern that I showed you earlier. So we'll keep an eye on it. Could see implications, maybe a slow start to the year in terms of El Nino for December, where we might still be sticking around in maybe a colder pattern before we open up into that split flow later in the year. We'll talk about that as we go through the months here, getting into the water year, the peak of it at least. But until then, thanks for watching.